The hardest magic isn't changing the shape of an object, but reshaping your own heart. In the flickering candlelight of the North Tower, hatred melts, revealing feelings more dangerous than any spell. The air in the Transfiguration classroom always tasted of chalk dust and ozone, a dry, electric flavor that used to signal triumph for Draco Malfoy. Now it tasted like ash. October rain lashed against the high arched windows of the castle, turning the afternoon sky into a bruised slate of grey. Inside, 30 wands were raised, 30 breaths held in concentration. McGonagall's voice, sharp as a cracked whip, cut through the silence. Intent, Mr. Malfoy. Visualization is nothing without intent. Draco stood at his desk, his posture rigid, the line of his shoulders drawn tight enough to snap. In front of him sat a silver goblet. It was mocking him. His task was simple, NEWT level standard, animate the inanimate. Turn the cold metal into a living, breathing turtle dove. He could do this in his sleep in 6th year. But that was before the war, before the manor, before his wand had been taken, returned, and now felt like a stranger's limb attached to his arm. Draco closed his eyes, blocking out the stares he could feel boring into the back of his neck. He visualized the bird, white feathers, the rapid beat of a heart, the desire for flight. He pushed his magic down his arm, willing it to obey. It surged, but not with the clean, cold precision of the Malfoy line. It felt jagged, hot, volatile. Avifors, he incanted, forcing the power out. There was a noise that sounded suspiciously like a wet cough. A flash of grey light erupted from the desk, blinding him for a second. When his vision cleared, the silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The goblet was gone. In its place sat something that was definitely not a turtle dove. It was a lump of silver flesh, pulsating rhythmically, with a single, terrified wing flapping uselessly against the wood, and a beak that opened to emit a metallic clank. Someone in the back row snickered. Draco felt the heat rise up his neck, a slow, humiliating burn that had nothing to do with magic. He stared at the abomination he had created, his stomach twisting. He vanished the creature with a slash of his wand, perhaps a little too violently, leaving only a scorch mark on the desk. "Mr. Malfoy," McGonagall said. Her tone wasn't angry. It was tired. That was worse. "See me after class." Draco didn't look up. He didn't look at the Gryffindors smirking behind their hands. He certainly didn't look at the front row, where a bush of brown hair was bent over a perfect, cooing white dove that was preening its feathers on a stack of parchment. He just stared at the grain of the wood on his desk and wished, for the first time in a long time, that the ground would simply open up and swallow him whole. The gargoyle guarding the headmistress's office jumped aside before Draco could even utter the password. He climbed the spiral staircase, the stone steps feeling steeper than usual. The office hadn't changed much since Dumbledore's time, though the instruments spun with a little less frenzy, and the portraits seemed to sleep more. McGonagall was sitting behind the massive desk, her hands clasped over a stack of files. Outside, the storm was picking up, thunder rumbling low in the throat of the sky. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. Draco sat. He kept his back straight, his face a mask of bored indifference. It was the only armor he had left. "I assume you know why you are here," she began, peering at him over her square spectacles. "My performance in Transfiguration has been suboptimal," Draco drawled, picking a piece of invisible lint from his robes. Suboptimal? McGonagall raised an eyebrow. Draco, you turned a teacup into a puddle of angry slime last week. Today, you created something that defies biological classification. Your practical work is falling apart. Draco's jaw tightened. I am having difficulty focusing. The wand is fine, she interrupted gently. The block is not in the wood, Mr. Malfoy. It is in you. She stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain hammer against the glass. The castles seemed to groan around them, a symphony of stone and magic. The Ministry has made your return to Hogwarts conditional upon your passing your NEWTS, she said, her back to him. If you fail a core subject, the terms of your probation are violated. You will be expelled. And given your history, expulsion will likely lead to a review of your freedom. The air in the rooms seemed to drop 10 degrees. Draco stared at her tartan robes. Expulsion. Azkaban. The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of a silver clock. I will study harder, he said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. I will hire a tutor from outside. No, McGonagall turned around. You need someone here. Someone who understands the curriculum and, frankly, someone who will not handle you with kid gloves because of your name. She pulled a piece of parchment from the stack on her desk. I have assigned you a peer tutor. You will meet 3 evenings a week, late nights so as to avoid scrutiny from the other students. Draco narrowed his eyes. Who? Not a Hufflepuff, I beg you. I can't learn from someone who apologizes to the furniture. Miss Granger. The name hung in the air like a curse. Draco actually laughed. It was a sharp, incredulous bark. Granger? You must be joking. She'd sooner hex me into oblivion than help me pass an exam. And I cannot work with her. She has already agreed, McGonagall said, her voice brooking no argument. She is the top student in the year. She understands the theory better than half the staff. And, unlike you at the moment, her intent is flawless. She hates me, Draco hissed, the mask slipping. We hate each other. It's a fundamental law of the universe, headmistress. Gravity pulls, fire burns, and Malfoys and Grangers do not mix. Then you had better learn to defy the laws of physics, Mr. Malfoy, McGonagall said, sitting back down and dipping her quill in ink. Because your first session is tonight, 8 o'clock, the abandoned astronomy classroom in the North Tower. Do not be late. The North Tower was freezing. It was a part of the castle that hadn't been fully repaired yet. The stone walls were drafty, and the wind howled through the cracks like a wounded animal. Draco stood in the doorway of the old classroom, his bag slung over one shoulder. The room was lit by a dozen floating candles that hovered unevenly near the ceiling. In the center of the room, surrounded by shadows, Hermione Granger was sitting at a dusty table, organizing a stack of books with aggressive precision. She looked tired. That was the first thing he noticed. The golden girl of Gryffindor had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a severe, messy bun, though several curls had escaped to frame her face. She was wearing a thick, oversized jumper that swallowed her hands. Draco hesitated. Every instinct in his body told him to turn around, leave, and take his chances with the Ministry. But the memory of the silver lump on his desk, the sheer pathetic nature of his failure, pinned him to the spot. He stepped inside, letting the heavy door creak shut behind him. Hermione's head snapped up. Her eyes were warm, brown, and currently narrowed in suspicion. She didn't smile. She didn't grimace. She just looked at him as if he were a complex equation she couldn't quite solve. "You're 3 minutes late," she said. Her voice was cool, echoing slightly in the empty stone room. Traffic on the stairs was murder, Draco deadpanned, walking slowly toward the table. He pulled out a chair opposite her and sat down, dropping his bag with a heavy thud. Ghost traffic. Nearly headless Nick wanted to discuss his Death Day party again. "Funny," Hermione said, not looking amused. She pushed a heavy leather-bound book toward him. "McGonagall says you're blocking. You have the power, but you're strangling it before it can manifest." "I am not strangling anything," Draco sneered, leaning back and crossing his arms. "Except perhaps my desire to be here." "Believe me, Malfoy, the feeling is mutual," she retorted, her quills scratching loudly against her parchment. "I have head girl duties, NEWTS of my own, and 1,000 better things to do than teach you how to turn a teapot into a tortoise." But McGonagall asked, "And unlike some people, I respect this school." "St. Potter isn't here to give you a medal for your charity," Draco snapped. The old rhythm of their bickering came easily, a familiar dance of venom. "You can drop the act. You're doing this to gloat, to watch the fall of the House of Malfoy up close." Hermione stopped writing. She looked up, and for a moment the candlelight caught the flecks of gold in her eyes. The expression on her face wasn't hate. It was a frighteningly calm assessment. "I don't care about your house, Draco," she said quietly. The use of his first name, even without warmth, felt like a shock of cold water. "And I don't care about your pride. I care about magic. And watching someone with your potential butcher basic transfiguration is offensive to me. It's wasteful." She stood up, grabbed her wand, and pointed it at the empty chair next to him. "Vera Verto." In a fluid, silent motion, the wooden chair swirled and morphed into a sleek white swan. The bird ruffled its feathers, looked around with beady black eyes, and let out a soft honk. "Show off," Draco muttered, though he couldn't help but stare at the elegance of the spell. "It's not showing off. It's confidence," Hermione said, cancelling the spell with a flick of her wrist. The chair returned with a dull thud. "You're afraid, Malfoy. You're afraid of your own wand. You're afraid that if you let go, something dark will come out." Draco felt his breath hitch. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. She had seen right through him, peeled back the layers of his defense with a single glance. It was infuriating. It was terrifying. "You don't know what you're talking about, Granger," he whispered, his voice dangerous. "Then prove me wrong," she challenged, leaning across the table. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows across her face that highlighted the curve of her cheekbone and the stubborn set of her mouth. "Pick up your wand. Transfigure this quill into a velvet ribbon. Now." She placed a simple white quill in front of him. Draco stared at the quill. He could feel her watching him, not with the mockery of his classmates, but with an intense, demanding focus. The air between them crackled, heavy with the scent of old paper and the coming storm outside. He reached for his wand. His hand trembled just barely. "If I turn this into a snake," he murmured, gripping the hawthorn wood, "don't say I didn't warn you." "If you turn it into a snake," Hermione said softly, her eyes locked on his, then at least you will have succeeded in creating something real. Draco looked from the quill to her face. In that moment, surrounded by the cold stone of the tower and the drumming of the rain, he realized two things. First, that Hermione Granger was the most irritatingly brilliant witch he had ever met. And second, that this was going to be the longest year of his life. "Fine," he said, exhaling a breath he didn't know he was holding. "Let's begin." The second session arrived on a Tuesday, carried in on a draft so biting it felt like the castle itself was hissing at them. Draco climbed the steps to the North Tower with the enthusiasm of a man walking to the gallows. His bag felt heavy, weighed down not by books, but by the crushing expectation of failure. Since their first meeting, he hadn't managed to transfigure a single thing correctly. His teacup had grown fur. His matchstick had ignited and nearly singed his eyebrows. His wand felt less like a conduit for power and more like a moody splinter he was forced to carry. When he pushed open the door, the scene was almost identical to the first night, though the atmosphere had shifted from icy hostility to a sort of grim trench warfare. Hermione was there, of course. She was standing by the window this time, looking out at the pitch-black grounds. The candlelight caught the frizzy halo of her hair, turning it into spun copper. She didn't turn around when he entered. "You're on time," she said to the glass. "I ran out of excuses," Draco muttered, dropping his bag onto the desk. The sound echoed in the high, vaulted ceiling. "And nearly headless Nick is sulking in the dungeons, so the stairs were clear." Hermione turned then. She looked tired again, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that suggested she wasn't going to let him slack off. She was wearing a different jumper, a dark green one that looked suspiciously like it might have belonged to Potter or Weasley. Draco felt a prickle of irritation at the thought, which he promptly shoved down into the mental box labelled "Things We Do Not Examine." "Vanishing spells," she announced, walking over to the table. She placed a small, ornate wooden music box in the centre. "5th year standard, Evanesco. You should be able to do this with your eyes closed, Malfoy." Draco stared at the music box. It was painted with delicate waltzing figures. It looked innocent. He hated it immediately. "I know the theory, Granger," he drawled, leaning against the desk and crossing his arms to hide the slight tremor in his hands. "Make the object go into non-being. Scatter the particles into the ether. Boring. Then do it." She crossed her arms, mirroring him. "If it's so boring, make it disappear. Then we can go to bed." The challenge hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Draco stepped up to the table. He drew his wand. The hawthorn wood felt warm, buzzing with that agitated static energy that had plagued him for months. He focused on the box. He tried to visualize the void. He tried to imagine the space where the box was, simply emptying. But his mind wasn't a void. It was a cacophony. It was the sound of the fiend fire in the room of requirement. It was the sound of his mother crying. It was the sound of the gavel at his trial. Into non-being, he thought desperately. Just go away. "Evanesco!" he shouted, slashing his wand downward with more force than necessary. He expected the box to vanish. He prayed for it to vanish. Instead, the box exploded. It wasn't a destructive explosion of fire and splintered wood. It was a soft, muffled pop, followed instantly by a sound that could only be described as a chaotic, rhythmic squeaking. Draco blinked. Hermione gasped. Where the music box had been, there was now a pile of bright yellow rubber chickens. There were at least a dozen of them, heaped atop one another like a grotesque pyramid, and they were expanding. As the spell settled, they seemed to inhale, inflating slightly, before letting out a collective, discordant squawk that reverberated off the stone walls like a banshee's wail. Hank! Draco stood frozen, his wand arm extended, horror washing over him in a cold wave. He had tried to vanish a music box and had created a rubber poultry farm. He started, but he was cut off by another squawk as one of the chickens slid off the pile and hit the floor with a wet thwack. He waited for it. He waited for the insults. He waited for Hermione Granger, the brightest witch of her age, to tear him apart. He waited for her to tell him he was pathetic, that he was a joke, that the Malfoy line had ended in a squeaking pile of rubber. He braced himself for the sneer that he deserved, but the sneer didn't come. Silence stretched out, broken only by the wheezing of the yellow monstrosities. Draco slowly turned his head to look at her, his stomach twisting in knots. Hermione was standing with her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were wide, staring at the chickens. Her shoulders were shaking. Draco flinched. "Go on," he snapped, his voice brittle. "Say it. Tell me I'm a disaster. Tell me I should snap my wand and go live with the Muggles." Hermione made a strangled noise. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. But then another chicken slid off the desk. Squawk! And she lost the battle. She didn't laugh cruelly. It wasn't the high, mocking laughter of the Slytherin common room. It was a genuine, bubbling sound that escaped through her fingers. She doubled over slightly, clutching her stomach. "I'm sorry," she gasped, her eyes tearing up. "I'm sorry, Draco, but are those rubber chickens?" Draco stared at her. She was laughing. She was laughing at him, yes, but there was no malice in it. It was the laughter of pure, unadulterated absurdity. "It was supposed to be a void," Draco defended weakly, lowering his wand. "I was visualizing silence." Well, Hermione wiped a tear from her eye, straightening up and taking a deep breath to steady herself. "You certainly failed at the silence part." She walked over to the desk, cautiously poking one of the yellow birds with the tip of her wand. It let out a pathetic squeak. "I think," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed mirth, "that your intent was a bit crowded. You didn't clear your mind, Malfoy. You just shoved everything into a box and blew the lid off." Draco looked at the pile. "I hate Transfiguration," he muttered. "I hate this subject. I hate this tower. And I particularly hate these chickens." "They are quite loud," she agreed, the corner of her mouth twitching. "But, technically speaking, it's a very advanced piece of conjuration. You created matter from nothing, even if the matter is ridiculous." She looked at him then, really looked at him. The humor was still dancing in her eyes, softening the usual hardness of her gaze. For the first time since the war, Draco didn't feel like a criminal in her presence. He just felt like a student who had made a mistake. "Here," she said, stepping closer. She moved into his personal space, bringing with her the scent of old parchment and vanilla. "Let me show you. You're holding your wrist too stiffly. You're chopping at the air. It needs to be a scoop, like you're scooping the object out of reality." She reached out, hovering her hand over his. "May I?" Draco stopped breathing. He looked at her hand, small, ink-stained, scarred slightly from the war. Then he looked at her face. She wasn't flinching. She wasn't scared of him. "Fine," he whispered. Hermione gently wrapped her fingers around his wrist. Her skin was warm, a shocking contrast to the cold stone of the room. A jolt of electricity, subtle but undeniable, shot up Draco's arm. He saw her eyes widen slightly, but she didn't pull away. "Relax your grip," she murmured, her voice lower than before. "You're strangling the wand." Draco forced his fingers to loosen. It was difficult. He was used to holding on for dear life. "Now," Hermione guided his hand. "Visualize the space empty. Don't push the magic. Pull the object away. Evanesco." They moved together. The motion was fluid, guided by her steady hand on his. The pile of rubber chickens vanished instantly. No noise, no explosion, just a clean return to the empty wooden desk. The silence that followed was profound. They stood there for a moment, the spell finished, but neither of them moved. Hermione's hand was still on his wrist. Draco could feel the pulse in her fingertips against his skin. He was acutely aware of how close she was, close enough to see the dusting of freckles across her nose, close enough to hear the soft intake of her breath. The tension shifted. It wasn't the tension of enemies anymore. It was something heavier, darker, and infinitely more dangerous. It was the tension of two magnets realizing they had been turned to face each other. Hermione realized it first. She snatched her hand back as if she had been burned, taking a half step backward. Her cheeks were flushed a faint pink. "Right," she said, her voice a little too high. That's the technique. You just need to practice the motion, without me." Draco flexed his hand, the ghost of her touch still burning on his skin. He felt unmoored. The anger he usually relied on was gone, replaced by a confusing swirl of embarrassment and gratitude? "Right," he echoed. He cleared his throat, desperate to regain some semblance of his usual composure. "Well, at least the poultry is gone. I imagine the house elves would have been confused." "Draco," Hermione said. She was gathering her books, her movements hurried, frantic. She paused, clutching a heavy tome to her chest. She looked at him one last time, her expression unreadable. "You're not hopeless. You're just loud. Inside." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and practically fled the room, her robes swirling around her ankles. Draco stood alone in the center of the north tower. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. He looked down at his wand, then at the empty desk where the chickens had been. He brought his wrist up to his face. It smelled faintly of vanilla. For a long time, he just stood there, listening to the silence, realizing that for the first time in months, the noise in his head had quieted down. And all it took was a pile of rubber chickens and the touch of a girl he was supposed to hate. He let out a short, incredulous breath that might have been a laugh. "Loud," he whispered to the empty room. He packed his bag. He didn't feel quite so heavy walking back to the dungeons. The darkness of the castle seemed less oppressive, perhaps because for a brief second someone had turned on a light. The following week passed in a blur of rain and mediocre coursework. Draco avoided Hermione in the Great Hall, though he felt her eyes on him more than once. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself the session in the tower was a fluke, a momentary lapse in judgment from both of them. But when Thursday night came, he found himself walking to the North Tower 10 minutes early. He told himself It was to prepare, to meditate, to clear his mind so he wouldn't embarrass himself again. It had nothing to do with the fact that he wanted to be there before she arrived, to set the stage, to have some control. He entered the classroom and stopped dead. Hermione was already there. She was asleep. She was slumped over the desk, her head resting on her crossed arms. A quill was still loosely gripped in her hand, and a puddle of ink was slowly spreading across a piece of parchment near her elbow. The floating candles had dimmed, casting a soft golden glow over her sleeping form. Draco moved quietly, his dragon-hide boots making no sound on the stone floor. He approached the desk cautiously, as if approaching a sleeping dragon. She looked younger when she slept. The lines of stress between her brows had smoothed out. Her lips were slightly parted. She looked peaceful and painfully vulnerable. Draco stood over her, looking down at the girl who had been his rival, his enemy, and his victim. He looked at the mudblood scar that was hidden beneath her sleeve. He knew it was there. He looked at the dark circles that even sleep couldn't erase. She was carrying the weight of the world, just like him. Except she was trying to fix it, while he was just trying to survive it. He should wake her. He should cough loudly, or drop a book, or make a snide comment about her drooling on the coursework. Instead, Draco reached out. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the ink pot that was dangerously close to tipping over onto her robes. With a delicate movement of his fingers, he levitated the ink pot and moved it to the safety of the windowsill. Then, he looked at the drafty window behind her, which was letting in a stream of cold night air. He flicked his wand silently. The window sealed shut. The room grew instantly warmer. He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. He didn't open his book. He didn't practice his spells. He just sat there, in the quiet, watching the candlelight dance across her hair, and waited for her to wake up. He told himself it was because he needed a tutor. He told himself it was because he needed to pass the exam. But as he sat there, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, Draco Malfoy knew he was lying. He was terrified of the NEWTs, yes. But he was starting to think he was far more terrified of whatever was happening in this room. Because for the first time, he didn't want to run away. He wanted to stay. And that, he suspected, was going to be the most dangerous magic of all. The wind battered the North Tower with a vengeance that made the very stones of the castle tremble. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of melting wax and the sharp, metallic tang of concentration. It was their 6th session, and the fragile truce established the week before had hardened into a working routine. They didn't trade insults, but they didn't trade pleasantries either. They existed in a bubble of quiet, intense study, broken only by the scratch of quills and the incantation of spells. Tonight, however, the air was charged with a different kind of electricity. Human transfiguration, Hermione said, her voice grave. She stood on the opposite side of the desk, a heavy tome open between them. It is the pinnacle of NEWT level work. And it is incredibly dangerous, Draco. If you get the calculations wrong, you don't just fail a test. You could fuse your bones. You could trap your consciousness in a partial state. Draco leaned back in his chair, twirling his wand between long, pale fingers. He looked bored, but Hermione noticed the tight line of his jaw. He was terrified, and therefore he was acting invincible. "I know the risks, Granger," he drawled. My father hired tutors from Durmstrang to teach me the theory when I was 15. I'm not going to fuse my bones. Theory is not practice, she countered, tapping the page. We start small, changing the colour of your hair, perhaps the shape of your eyebrows. Draco scoffed, sitting up straight. Eyebrows? I have a deadline, Granger. McGonagall wants to see significant progress by Friday. Turning my hair pink isn't going to impress anyone. I need to demonstrate a partial animagus transformation. That is insanity, Hermione snapped, closing the book with a thud. You can't jump from vanishing rubber chickens to self-transfiguration in 2 weeks. It requires total mastery of self. You have to hold your human form in your mind while simultaneously imposing the animal form over it. I can do it, Draco insisted. He stood up, adrenaline and pride mixing into a toxic cocktail in his blood. He felt the need to prove himself, not just to McGonagall, but to the witch staring at him with such infuriating doubt. I'm going to transform my hand, just the hand, into a falcon's talon. Draco, don't... Watch me. He didn't wait for her permission. He raised his wand, pointing it at his own left hand resting on the desk. He closed his eyes, searching for the image of the falcon, sharp, predatory, noble. He wanted the power of flight. He wanted the razor-edged danger of the predator. He pushed his magic into the intent, hard, too hard. He felt the resistance, the block McGonagall had spoken of, and he shoved against it with all his might, channeling his frustration, his fear and his arrogance into a single point. Mutare, he shouted. The world dissolved in a rush of cold, slimy vertigo. There was no pain exactly, but there was a terrifying sensation of shrinking. The ceiling shot upwards, miles away. The desk, previously waist height, became a vast wooden plane beneath him. His vision blurred, shifting from the sharp clarity of human sight to a sudden dizzying wideness. The colours washed out. Movement became everything. He tried to shout, "What happened?" What came out was a loud, resonant croak. Draco froze, or he tried to freeze. His body felt strange, squat, heavy, and wet. He looked down at his hands. They were not hands. They were green, webbed, sticky appendages. He panicked. The instinct was immediate and overwhelming. He kicked out, expecting to run, but his powerful back legs launched him into the air with terrifying force. He soared across the plane of the desk, a chaotic projectile of green slime, heading straight for the edge of the precipice. Draco! A giantess was screaming his name. Just as he was about to plummet to his death on the stone floor below, warm, soft barriers slammed down around him. He crashed into them, sliding slightly. Fingers, giant fingers. Hermione Granger had caught him. She scooped him up, her hands forming a protective cup. Draco, currently a rather large, warty toad, sat trembling in her palms. His heart was hammering against his ribs at a speed that felt like it would explode his small chest. He blinked his bulbous, golden eyes, looking up at her face. From this angle, she was terrifying. Her eyes were enormous pools of amber, wide with shock. Her breathing was a hurricane. "Oh my God," she whispered, bringing him closer to her face. "You idiot. You absolute, colossal idiot." Draco wanted to bite her. He wanted to scream that he was a Malfoy and demanded to be put down. But all he could do was let out a pathetic, high-pitched meep. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice shaking slightly. "Don't move. If you jump now, you'll splatter." She moved carefully away from the desk, carrying him toward the light of the candles. Draco felt the warmth of her skin seeping into his cold amphibian belly. It was nice, horrifyingly nice. Her hands were gentle, her thumbs stroking the bumpy skin of his back in a way that was probably meant to soothe a wild animal, but felt scandalously intimate to a human man trapped inside. "You didn't visualize a falcon," she murmured, seemingly talking to herself as she examined him. "You visualized escape. You visualized hiding. And you pushed too hard, so the magic took the path of least resistance." She set him down on the velvet cushion of a chair, but kept her hands hovering around him to prevent escape. She looked deep into his toad eyes. "I have to reverse this manually," she told him, her tone shifting into pure professional focus. "A general finite might shock your system and leave you with webbed feet for a month. I have to pull the human form back out." Draco blinked. "Do it," he thought. "For the love of Merlin, Granger, fix me." "This is going to feel odd," she warned. She placed her hands on him again. This time she didn't just hold him. She covered him. Her palms pressed against his sides, her fingers resting lightly on the top of his head. "Hominum revelio. Restituo," she whispered. It started as a tickle in his spine. Then heat. A rush of heat that started where her skin touched his and spread like wildfire. The world twisted again. The ceiling rushed down. The colors sharpened. His body stretched, cracked, and expanded with a violence that made him gasp. 1 second, he was a toad the size of a teacup. The next second, he was a man, sprawling awkwardly in the chair, gasping for air. But Hermione hadn't moved back quickly enough. Because he had grown so suddenly, and because she had been leaning over him to perform the spell, they ended up in a tangle of limbs. Draco was slumped in the chair, his legs sprawled, his shirt collar askew, and the top buttons popped from the transformation. And Hermione was standing between his knees, her hands still resting on his face. The silence that fell over the room was heavier than the stone walls. Draco's chest heaved as he gulped down oxygen. His skin felt too tight, prickling with the aftershocks of the magic. But the loudest sensation was the feeling of her palms against his cheeks. She was cupping his face. Her thumbs were resting just beneath his eyes, tracing the sharp line of his cheekbones. She was staring at him, her lips parted in shock, her pupils blown wide. She seemed to have forgotten to let go. Draco froze. He stared up at her. He could see the pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat. He could smell the rain on her clothes and the ink on her fingers. He felt a sudden, terrifying urge to lean into her touch, to turn his head and press his lips against her palm. "You're back," she whispered. Her voice was breathless, barely audible over the storm outside. "I'm back," Draco croaked. His voice was rough, damaged from the croaking. She didn't pull away. Her eyes searched his face, scanning for any remaining signs of the toad, checking his pupils, his skin texture. It was a medical examination, he told himself. She was just being thorough. But medical examinations didn't usually involve looking at someone's mouth like that. You have a graze," she murmured, her thumb brushing a tiny scrape on his jawline where he had hit her hands when she caught him. The touch sent a jolt of lightning straight down Draco's spine, pooling hotly in his stomach. He stopped breathing entirely. The air between them was so thick, it felt like water. If he moved, if he lifted his hand to touch her waist, the entire world would shatter. "Hermione," he said. He didn't realize he had used her name until it hung in the air between them. The sound of it seemed to wake her up. She blinked rapidly, her cheeks flooding with a violent shade of crimson. She snatched her hands away from his face as if he were made of red-hot iron. I checked your vitals," she stammered, taking a large, clumsy step back. She bumped into the desk, knocking over a stack of parchment. Standard procedure. When reversing a species-cross transfiguration, one must ensure the cardiac rhythm is stable. Draco remained in the chair, his heart beating a rhythm that was anything but stable. He brought a hand up to his face, touching the spot where her thumb had been. His skin burned. He slowly stood up. His legs felt shaky, but he forced himself to stand tall. He buttoned his collar with trembling fingers, trying to regain some shred of dignity. "I suppose," he said, his voice struggling to find its usual drawl and failing, "that I owe you my life. Again." Hermione was busy gathering the fallen parchments, her back to him. He could see the tips of her ears were burning red. "You owe me a new quill," she said, her voice muffled. "You crushed mine when you hopped." "I'll buy you a dozen," Draco said. He looked at her back. He wanted to say something else. He wanted to apologize for his arrogance. He wanted to ask why she hadn't laughed. He wanted to ask why her hands had been so gentle. But the fear was back. Not the fear of the exam, but the fear of this new, terrifying territory. "Granger," he said softly. She paused, clutching the papers, but didn't turn around. "Thank you." It was the first sincere thing he'd said to her in 8 years. Hermione stood still for a heartbeat. Then she gave a stiff nod. "Go to the dormitory, Draco. Drink water. Don't practice any more tonight." "Good night, Hermione." Draco grabbed his bag and walked to the door. He didn't look back, but he could feel her presence like a physical weight against his shoulder blades. He walked down the spiral staircase, his mind a chaotic whirl. He should be humiliated. He had turned himself into a toad in front of his academic rival. He had been helpless, slimy, and pathetic. But as he walked through the cold, drafty corridors of the dungeon, all he could think about was the warmth of her palms. He touched his cheek again. He was in trouble. He was in serious, catastrophic trouble. Because for a brief, insane moment before she pulled away, Draco was certain, absolutely certain, that he hadn't wanted her to stop. He realized then that the danger of the lessons wasn't that he might fail. The danger was that he might succeed, and in doing so, bind himself to the one person he was never supposed to want. Draco Malfoy entered the Slytherin common room, ignored the questioning looks of his housemates, and went straight to his room. He lay down on his bed and stared at the dark canopy, listening to the rain, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel cold. He felt terrified, he felt confused, and he felt inexplicably, dangerously alive. November arrived not with a roar, but with a relentless, drowning whisper. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the grounds into a mud-slicked marsh and wrapping the castle in a shroud of grey mist. The dampness seemed to seep through the stone walls, into the tapestries, and straight into the marrow of Draco Malfoy's bones. Yet, as he navigated the corridors toward the North Tower, Draco realized with a jolt of unease that he wasn't cold. In fact, there was a strange, unfamiliar warmth in his chest, a kind of humming anticipation that he hadn't felt since, well, perhaps ever. He adjusted the strap of his bag and tightened his grip on the 2 steaming thermoses he was levitating slightly ahead of him. It was a peace offering, or perhaps it was payment. Or maybe, and this was the thought he refused to entertain, it was just an excuse to see her smile again. Since the toad incident, now referred to in his mind as the Great Amphibian Debacle, the dynamic between them had shifted. The jagged edges of their hostility had been sanded down. They weren't friends. Friendship implied a history that didn't involve torture and prejudice. But they were co-conspirators. They were 2 soldiers left behind on a battlefield, realizing they were the only ones who spoke the same language. He pushed open the heavy oak door. The classroom was a sanctuary. Outside, the wind battered the glass, a chaotic symphony of the elements. Inside, the air was still and warm. Hermione had arrived early, as usual, and had transformed the harsh, empty space. Dozens of candles floated at varying heights, casting a soft, golden net of light over the room. She had even transfigured the hard wooden chairs into plush, velvet armchairs. She was sitting in one of them, her legs tucked underneath her, reading a book that looked heavy enough to knock out a troll. "You're dripping," she said, without looking up, turning a page with a crisp snap. "Hello to you too, Granger," Draco said, shaking his cloak. He banished the water with a quick flick of his wand, sending a spray of mist into the corner. "I come bearing gifts, and this is how I am greeted, with observations on my hydrostatus." Hermione lowered the book. Her eyes were warm, reflecting the candlelight. She looked comfortable, safe. It was a look that made Draco's throat tighten. "Gifts?" She raised an eyebrow. Draco guided the floating thermoses onto the desk between them. "Coffee, from the kitchens. It's strong enough to wake the dead, which, given the weather, seemed appropriate." He watched her face carefully. A week ago, she would have inspected the cup for poison. Today, she just reached out, wrapped her hands around the warm metal and inhaled deeply. "Oh, thank God," she groaned, a sound of pure, unadulterated pleasure. "I've been up since 4 reviewing arithmancy charts. If I stare at one more number, I'm going to hallucinate." "Drink," Draco commanded, taking the other chair. He sank into the velvet, feeling the tension of the day bleed out of his shoulders. "If the head girl dies of exhaustion, I'll be blamed. Malfoy booby-traps arithmancy chart, the prophet will say." Hermione laughed softly into her cup. The sound was low and intimate, muffled by the rain outside. She took a sip and sighed, her eyes fluttering shut for a brief second. Draco watched the movement, the dark lashes against her pale skin, the relaxation of her jaw. He felt like a voyeur, witnessing a private moment of relief. He quickly looked away, focusing on the table. "So, what's the torture for tonight?" Hermione set the coffee down, her demeanor shifting back to teacher mode, though the edge was softer now. "Substance swapping," she said, tapping the book. "Substantia mutatio. We're moving away from living things for a bit, for obvious reasons." "Wise," Draco murmured. "I prefer my skin without warts." "Tonight, we are turning wood into metal," she explained. She placed a small, roughly carved wooden dragon on the table. It was crude, likely a first-year's whittling project. "It's about density, weight, coldness. You have to understand the molecular structure of the wood and convince it to become silver." "Convince it?" Draco picked up the wooden dragon. It was light, warm, and porous. "It's not a debate, Granger. It's domination. You force the change." "That's why you fail," she said simply. She wasn't looking at him with disdain. She was looking at him with an intensity that made him want to squirm. She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. "Magic isn't just force, Draco. It's negotiation. Wood is alive, or it was. Metal is cold, conductive, rigid. You can't just shout metal and expect the wood to obey. You have to guide it. You have to show it what you want it to become." She held out her hand. "Give it to me." Draco handed her the wooden carving. Their fingers brushed. The contact was brief, a fleeting friction of skin, but it sent a static shock through him that had nothing to do with the weather. He saw her hesitate, just for a fraction of a second before she took the object. "Watch," she whispered. She didn't shout. She didn't slash her wand. She simply held the wooden dragon in her palm, pointed her wand at it, and breathed. "Argentum." The change was slow, mesmerizing. It started at the tail, a ripple of liquid mercury washing over the grain of the wood. It moved up the body, the brown turning to gleaming silver, the rough edges smoothing out into polished perfection. In seconds, the crude wooden toy was gone. In her hand sat a heavy, gleaming silver dragon, catching the candlelight in a dozen glittering reflections. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with the simple joy of magic. "See? I didn't break it. I just changed its mind." Draco stared at the silver dragon and then at her. He realized with a terrifying clarity that he wasn't looking at a mudblood. He wasn't looking at Potter's sidekick. He was looking at the most powerful witch in the castle, and she was sitting 3 feet away from him, smelling of rain and coffee, trying to teach him how to be better. "Show me," he said, his voice husky. She handed him the silver dragon. He muttered the counterspell, and it returned to wood. "Close your eyes," Hermione instructed softly. The rain hammered against the glass, a rhythmic drumbeat that sealed them into this bubble of light. "Don't think about the spell. Think about the feeling of silver. Think about something cold, something enduring, something precious." Draco closed his eyes. Something cold. That was easy. The manor in winter, the dungeon walls, something enduring. The Malfoy name? No, that was tarnished. The war? No. He searched his mind for something that felt like silver, something that was bright in the darkness, something valuable. An image floated to the surface of his mind, not an object, a person. He saw Hermione in the library, illuminated by a single lamp. He saw her laughing at his rubber chickens. He saw her hands holding a toad with gentle reverence. He saw the flash of gold in her eyes when she challenged him. She was silver. She was the sharp, bright thing that cut through the grey sludge of his life. She was cold to his touch, but precious. He focused on that feeling, the feeling of admiration he had buried under layers of spite, the feeling of wanting to be worthy of the light she cast. He gripped the wooden dragon. He didn't try to crush it. He poured that feeling into it, the desire to be something else, the desire to shine. "Argentum," he whispered. He felt the magic leave him. It didn't burn this time. It flowed. It felt like cool water running down a stream. He opened his eyes. The dragon on the table was silver. It wasn't just silver. It was exquisite. The crude carving had been refined. The scales were detailed, microscopic in their precision. The wings were spread wide, catching the light. It was a masterpiece of transfiguration. Draco stared at it, his breath caught in his throat. He had done it, and he hadn't used anger. He hadn't used fear. "Draco," Hermione breathed. He looked up. She was staring at the dragon, her mouth slightly open. She reached out and touched the silver wing with one finger. "It's beautiful," she whispered. She looked at him then, and the expression on her face nearly brought him to his knees. It was pride, genuine, unmasked pride. "You did it. You really did it." Draco struggled to find words. "I visualized value. It worked." She was smiling at him. Not a smirk, not a polite grimace. A real smile that reached her eyes and crinkled the corners. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the previous weeks. It wasn't empty. It was full. It was heavy with things that couldn't be said. The storm outside seemed to fade away. The only thing in the world was the golden circle of candlelight and the girl sitting across from him. Draco felt a magnetic pull, a physical urge to lean forward. He watched the light play on her throat. He wondered what she would do if he reached out and touched the curl of hair that had fallen over her forehead. Hermione's smile faded slowly, replaced by a look of dawning awareness. She didn't look away. She seemed pinned by his gaze, her breath hitching slightly. The air between them crackled, thicker than the magic they had just performed. They were too close. The table between them felt insignificant. "Draco," she said again, but this time it wasn't praise. It was a question. It was a warning. It was a plea. He leaned in, just an inch. "Hermione." The use of her name felt like a caress. She wet her lips. Her eyes dropped to his mouth, then snapped back up to his eyes, wide and startled. The vulnerability in that look shattered him. She wasn't rejecting him. She was waiting. He could kiss her. The realization hit him like a bludger. He could lean across this desk, bury his hands in that impossible hair, and kiss her until the world stopped making sense. And the terrifying part was, he thought she might let him. But then the clock on the wall chimed the hour, a deep, resonant bong that echoed through the tower. The spell broke. Hermione jerked back as if she'd been stung. She knocked her coffee cup, catching it just before it spilled. Her face was flushed a deep, violent red. She stammered, standing up abruptly. She grabbed her book, clutching it to her chest like a shield. "It's late. I have rounds. I have papers." Draco stood up too, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt dizzy, as if he'd just stepped off a spinning broom. "Right," he said, his voice rough. "Rounds." You did well tonight," she said, backing toward the door. She wouldn't meet his eyes. "Keep practicing the visualization, the value." "I will," Draco said. She turned and fled. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving him alone in the candlelight. Draco sank back into the chair. He picked up the silver dragon. It was still cold from the transformation. He ran his thumb over the sharp wing. He had succeeded. He was learning. But as he sat there, listening to the rain resume its assault on the tower, Draco realized that the danger was no longer about failing the exam. He was falling in love with her. He looked at the empty chair where she had sat, the imprint of her body still visible on the velvet cushion. He brought the silver dragon to his lips, closing his eyes. "Damn you," Granger, he whispered into the darkness. But there was no venom in it, only a desperate, aching longing. He pocketed the dragon. He wouldn't turn it back, not this one, and blew out the candles, walking back into the dark castle with a light burning in his chest that he knew, with sinking dread, would eventually burn him alive. The warmth of the previous week had evaporated, leaving behind a bitter, biting frost that seemed to settle in the very marrow of the castle walls. It was early December now. The windows of the North Tower were rimmed with ice, opaque and unyielding, turning the classroom into a grey twilight box. Draco stood in the centre of the room, his chest heaving, sweat trickling down his spine despite the pervasive chill. The air smelled of sulphur and something rotting, the distinct, cloying scent of failed dark magic. "Again," Hermione said. Her voice was steady, but there was a tightness in it, a wire pulled taut that hadn't been there before. She stood near the blackboard, her arms crossed, watching him with an expression that hovered somewhere between patience and frustration. "I can't," Draco rasped, wiping his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "It's not working. The formula is wrong." "The formula is perfect," she corrected, stepping forward. "The incantation is standard. The wand movement is precise. The variable, Draco, is you." They were attempting the animus nobilis, the transfiguration of a statue into a guardian. It was a spell that required not just visualization, but a core of pure protective intent. It required the caster to draw upon a memory of safety, of shielding, of unselfish defense. McGonagall had put it on the syllabus as the final hurdle before the exam. "To create a protector," she had written, "one must understand what is worth protecting." Draco looked at the statue on the floor. It was a simple stone hound, roughly the size of a grim. Every time he cast the spell, it didn't turn into a noble guardian. It turned into a snarling, shadowy beast with too many teeth and eyes that burned with a red manic light. He had to banish it before it bit him. "You're using fear," Hermione said, her voice dropping lower. She walked into his line of sight, forcing him to look at her. "I can feel it coming off you. You're pouring adrenaline and panic into the stone. You're creating a monster because you're afraid of what's in the dark." "I am a Malfoy," Draco snapped, the old defense mechanism sliding into place like a rusty bolt. "I grew up in the dark. I don't fear it." "Then why are your hands shaking?" Draco looked down. His left hand, clutching the hawthorn wand, was trembling violently. He clenched his fist to stop it, hate flaring in his gut. Hate for the spell, hate for the war, and hate for the girl who saw too much. "It requires a memory of safety," Hermione said softly. She took a step closer, entering his personal space. The scent of her, vanilla and old paper, was a sharp contrast to the sulphur. "Think, Draco. A moment where you felt safe, where you felt good." "I don't have those," he spat, turning away from her. "My house was a headquarters for the Dark Lord. My childhood was a training ground. I don't have warm, fuzzy memories of baking cookies, Granger." "You do," she insisted. She reached out, her fingers hovering inches from his arm but not touching. "Last week, with the dragon, you felt it then. You felt worth." "That was a fluke," he lied. "A trick of the light." "It wasn't." Her voice was relentless. "Think about your mother. Think about us. Here, when we're working." Draco froze. The image flashed in his mind unbidden. Hermione laughing at the rubber chickens. Hermione sleeping on her desk. The way she had looked at him in the candlelight, like he was something precious. For a second, the warmth flooded him. He felt the spark of the spell. But then, the shadow came. The doubt. She is the heroine, the voice in his head whispered. You are the Death Eater. You are the boy who let them into the castle. You stood by while she was tortured in your own drawing room. You don't get to have this. You don't get to be safe with her. You taint her just by breathing the same air. The memory of her screams at the manor overlaid the memory of her laughter. The guilt crashed into him like a physical blow. It was suffocating. It was unbearable. He couldn't do this. He couldn't be the man she wanted him to be. He was broken, and he was going to drag her down into the wreckage with him if he didn't stop. The magic in his wand flared, but it wasn't golden. It was black. Animus, he shouted, not to cast the spell, but to release the pressure in his chest. The stone hound exploded. Shards of granite flew across the room like shrapnel. Hermione gasped, throwing up a shield charm just in time, but the force of the blast knocked her backward. She stumbled, her hip colliding hard with the edge of the desk. Books cascaded to the floor with a deafening crash. Silence followed. Dust hung in the air. Draco stood amidst the rubble of the statue, breathing hard. He looked at Hermione. She was clutching her side, her face pale, eyes wide with shock. He had hurt her. Again. The self-loathing that rose up in his throat was acidic. It burned away the tentative hope of the last few weeks. It burned away the friendship. It left only the cold, hard reality of who he was. "Get out," Draco said. His voice was dead. Hermione straightened up, wincing slightly. "Draco, it was an accident. You lost control. We just need to—" "I said, get out," he roared, spinning on her. He looked wild, his hair falling into his eyes, his face twisted in a sneer that felt like a mask he had to glue back on. "This is useless. It's a waste of time. I'm not going to pass, and I certainly don't need you pitying me while I fail." Hermione didn't flinch this time. She stood her ground, though her hand was still pressed to her side. "I don't pity you. I believe in you. Why does that terrify you so much?" "Because you're a fool." Draco stepped closer, using his height to loom over her, using every ounce of his pure-blood arrogance to build a wall between them. "You think you can save everyone, don't you? St. Potter's sidekick, fixing the broken things. Well, I am not a broken elf, Granger. I am not a cause for you to champion so you can sleep better at night." The words were cruel. They were calculated to wound. He saw them hit their mark. Hermione's expression didn't crumble, but the light in her eyes went out. She looked at him as if he were a stranger, as if the last month had never happened. "Is that what you think this is?" she asked quietly. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "Charity. What else could it be?" Draco laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "We are enemies, Granger. Nature intended us to hate each other. Just because we shared a few coffees and you taught me to fold a napkin properly doesn't change what I am, and it doesn't change what you are." He stopped. He almost said the word. He didn't. He couldn't go that far. But the implication hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Hermione looked at him for a long, agonizing moment. She saw the fear behind the rage. She saw the trembling of his hands. She saw the boy who was drowning and pushing away the life raft because he felt he deserved to sink. But she also had her pride. "I see," she said. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply walked over to the desk. She picked up her bag, slinging it over her shoulder. She gathered her books, stacking them neatly. She walked to the door. Her hand rested on the iron handle. "You're right, Draco," she said, her back to him. "I can't fix you. I can teach you the mechanics of magic. I can show you how to wave a wand. But I can't make you believe you're worthy of redemption. That's a spell you have to cast yourself." She opened the door. The cold draft from the corridor rushed in, swirling the dust around Draco's ankles. "And for the record," she added, her voice cracking just a fraction, "I never saw you as a project. I saw you as just you." The door clicked shut. Draco was alone. The silence of the North Tower was absolute. The candles, sensing the shift in the room's energy, flickered and died one by one, plunging him into semi-darkness. Draco stood frozen in the center of the debris. He looked at the closed door. He wanted to run after her. He wanted to tear the door open and beg her to come back, to tell her he lied, that he was terrified, that she was the only thing making him feel human. But his feet were lead. The chains of his past were too heavy. He sank to his knees on the cold stone floor, amidst the shattered remains of the guardian he couldn't create. He put his head in his hands. He had done it. He was safe. He had driven her away. She wouldn't look at him with hope anymore, so he wouldn't have to disappoint her. He was back in the cold where a Malfoy belonged. He gasped, a dry, racking sob that tore through his chest. "Coward," he whispered to the empty room. "You absolute coward." Outside, the snow began to fall, burying the castle in white, silent oblivion. Inside, Draco Malfoy sat in the dark, wishing he had let the statue bite him, wishing he could feel anything other than the crushing weight of his own successful sabotage. 3 days of silence felt less like a pause and more like a suffocation. The castle was buried under a fresh blanket of December snow, the white glare outside mocking the grey mood that had settled over Draco. He moved through the corridors like a ghost haunting his own life. He went to classes, he ate, barely, and he stared at the ceiling of his dormitory until his eyes burned. But he didn't go to the North Tower. The absence of the sessions was a physical ache. He hadn't realized how much he had come to rely on that drafty, candlelit room. It wasn't just the magic, it was the oxygen. For 2 hours a night, he wasn't the ex-Death Eater, the pariah, or the disappointment. He was just a student struggling with a spell, and she was just the girl who wouldn't let him quit. And he had thrown it away, because he was a coward, because the moment the warmth became real, he had panicked and doused it with ice. "I never saw you as a project." Her words replayed in his head on an endless loop, cutting deeper than any curse she could have hurled. On the third night, 2 days before the final exam, Draco found himself standing in front of the library doors. It was late, past curfew for most, but the lights were still on. He told himself he was there for a reference book on vanishing charms. He told himself he needed to study alone. He was a liar. He walked into the vast, hushed cathedral of books. The air smelled of dust and binding glue, a scent that was inextricably linked to her. He moved through the stacks, his footsteps silent on the stone floor, guided by an instinct he refused to name. He found her in the arithmancy section. She was sitting on a small wooden step stool at the end of a narrow aisle, surrounded by towers of books. She wasn't reading. She was staring at a blank piece of parchment, her quill hovering motionless in her hand. Her posture was slumped, the fierce, straight-backed defiance of the head girl replaced by a weary curvature of the spine. She looked small. She looked lonely. Draco stood in the shadows of the shelves, watching her. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, painful rhythm. He could turn around. He could leave. He could accept that he had burned this bridge and simply survive the fallout. But then she sighed, a soft, shaky sound that echoed in the quiet aisle, and rubbed her temples as if trying to massage away a headache. That small gesture of fatigue broke him. Draco stepped out of the shadows. "You're going to ruin your eyes reading in this light," he said. His voice was rough, unused. Hermione jumped, her quill clattering to the floor. She spun around on the stool, her wand half drawn before she recognized him. When she saw him, her expression didn't soften. It closed off. Her face became a smooth, impassive mask. "Malfoy," she said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of presence. "If you're looking for the Transfiguration section, it's 2 aisles over." "I'm not looking for books," Draco said. He walked closer. He felt exposed, stripped of his usual armor. He stopped 3 feet away from her, the exact distance of the desk in the North Tower. "Then what do you want?" She picked up her quill, her fingers gripping it tightly. "I'm busy, Draco. I don't have time for another lecture on why I'm a fool for trying to help you." The sting was deserved. Draco took it without flinching. "I didn't come to lecture," he said quietly. He reached into the pocket of his robes. Hermione watched his hand, her body tense, ready for a hex. But he didn't pull out his wand. He pulled out a small object wrapped in green velvet cloth. He held it out to her. Hermione looked at the bundle, then at his face. Suspicion warred with curiosity in her eyes. "What is this?" "The homework," he said. "Or an attempt at it." She hesitated. The silence stretched, heavy and fragile. Finally, she reached out and took the bundle. Her fingers brushed his palm, a ghost of the touch he had craved for days, and he had to fight the urge to catch her hand. She unwrapped the cloth. Inside lay the stone hound. It was the same statue he had exploded 3 nights ago. He had spent the last 48 hours scouring the floor of the North Tower for every shard, every grain of dust. He had used reparo, yes, but that was just the surface. He had used a dozen other spells, fusing, smoothing, refining. But more than that, he had changed it. The hound was no longer snarling. It was sitting on its haunches, alert but calm. Its stone head was tilted slightly, as if listening. And its eyes, 2 tiny chips of obsidian he had transfigured from the rubble, were not red. They were dark and steady. Hermione stared at the little statue in her palm. She traced the line of its ear with her thumb. "You fixed it," she whispered. "I tried," Draco said, his voice low. "It took some time. The stone was stubborn." "It's perfect," she murmured. She looked up at him then, and the mask was gone. Her eyes were searching his, looking for the truth beneath the pale exterior. "Why, Draco?" "Because I broke it," he said simply. He took a step closer, invading her space, needing her to understand without him having to say the words that stuck in his throat. "And I don't want to leave things broken anymore. Not this. Not us." The word hung in the air. Us. A dangerous, undefined entity. Hermione let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for days. The tension in her shoulders dropped. She looked down at the hound, then placed it gently on the stack of books beside her. "The exam is on Friday," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor of emotion underneath. "I know," Draco said. "I'm not ready." "No," she agreed. A small, tentative smile touched her lips. "You're not. You still haven't mastered the Guardian spell. The dog is pretty, Draco, but it's still just stone. It doesn't live." "Then teach me," he said. It was a surrender. "One last time. Please." Hermione studied him. She saw the exhaustion in his face, the raw honesty he was offering her. She nodded slowly. "Meet me in the tower," she said. 10 minutes. The North Tower felt different this time. The cold was still there, seeping through the stones, but it felt less biting. Perhaps because Draco was no longer fighting it. They stood on opposite sides of the desk. The repaired stone hound sat in the center. "The block is still the same," Hermione said softly. The atmosphere was hushed, reverent. "You fixed the vessel, Draco. Now you have to fill it. You have to give it a soul." Draco drew his wand. The hawthorn wood felt heavy, buzzing with his anxiety. "I tried the memories," he confessed, staring at the stone dog. "I tried to think of the manor before the war. I tried to think of flying. It's all tainted. The fear bleeds into it." "Then stop looking back," Hermione said. She walked around the desk. She didn't stop until she was standing next to him, close enough that her sleeve brushed his. "You're looking for safety in the past," she whispered. "But the past isn't safe for you. You have to find safety in the now." Draco turned his head to look at her. In the candlelight, her eyes were pools of warm amber. She wasn't looking at the statue. She was looking at him. She was standing beside the ex-Death Eater, the boy who had called her a mudblood, the boy who had broken everything he touched, and she wasn't leaving. "Safety," he repeated, the word tasting strange on his tongue. "What makes you feel grounded, Draco?" she asked. "What makes the noise in your head stop?" He looked at her. He looked at the way the light caught the stray curls at her temple. He remembered her hands on his face when he was a toad. He remembered her laughter over the rubber chickens. He remembered the way she had defended him to McGonagall. He realized then that he had been looking for a place, a room, a time. But safety wasn't a place. Safety was the person standing next to him. Safety was the feeling that, no matter how far he fell, she would catch him. Or at least, she would stand in the dark with him until he could find the light himself. "I know," he whispered. He didn't look away from her. He kept his eyes locked on hers, anchoring himself to her gaze. He let the walls in his mind crumble. He let the Malfoy armor dissolve. He let himself feel the terrifying, overwhelming gratitude he had for her. He felt the magic swell in his chest. It wasn't the hot, jagged fire of anger. It wasn't the cold slime of fear. It was warm. It was solid. It was gold. He raised his wand, pointing it blindly at the statue, but his focus was entirely on her. "Animus nobilis," he breathed. The air in the room rushed inward, as if the world was taking a deep breath. There was no explosion. There was no flash of blinding light. Instead, there was a sound, a low, deep thrum, like the heartbeat of the earth. Draco felt the magic pour out of him, smooth and effortless. It flowed down his arm, through the wand, and into the stone. He felt a connection snap into place, a tether between his will and the object. "Look," Hermione whispered. Draco broke his gaze and looked down. The stone hound was gone. Standing on the desk was a creature of pure liquid silver. It wasn't metal. It was light given form. It was a corporeal Patronus made of matter. The hound stood tall, its coat shimmering like moonlight on water. It threw back its head and let out a sound, not a bark, but a clear, resonant chime that vibrated in Draco's bones. It turned its head and looked at Draco. Then it looked at Hermione. It bowed its head to her, a gesture of absolute respect. Draco lowered his wand. His hand was steady. "You did it," Hermione said. Her voice was thick with tears. She reached out, her hand hovering near the silver creature. The hound nudged her palm with its nose. It's warm." "It's a protector," Draco said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. He felt lightheaded, drained, but incredibly clean. "It's beautiful," she said. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "What did you think of? What was the memory?" Draco looked at the silver hound, then back at her. The air between them crackled, charged with the residual magic, and something else, something far more volatile. He could tell her. He could tell her that he didn't think of a memory at all. He could tell her that he thought of the way she looked at him when he handed her the coffee. He could tell her that she was the only good thing he had left, but he wasn't brave enough for that yet. "I thought of the quiet," he lied softly. "Just the quiet." Hermione studied him. He knew she didn't believe him. He knew she could see the truth written in the way he was looking at her. "The quiet is good," she said softly, accepting the lie for what it was, a shield. She stepped closer. The silver hound dissipated into a mist of sparkling light, leaving the stone statue back on the desk, inert but perfect. They were alone in the semi-darkness again. "You're going to pass," Hermione said. "I might," Draco conceded. "You will." She reached out and, for the first time, she initiated the touch. She placed her hand on his forearm. Her grip was firm, grounding. "You have the intent, Draco. You have the heart. You just have to stop fighting it." Draco looked down at her hand on his arm, the black fabric of his sleeve against her pale skin. It looked right. "Thank you," he said, and this time he meant more than just the lesson. "You're welcome." She didn't pull away. They stood there in the silence of the tower, the storm outside a distant memory, the warmth of her hand seeping into his skin. And for the first time in years, Draco Malfoy didn't feel like he was drowning. He felt like he was finally learning how to swim. "One more time?" she asked softly. Draco nodded, lifting his wand, ready to cast the spell again. Not for the grade, but just to feel that light again, to feel worthy of the girl standing beside him. One more time. The corridor leading to the Transfiguration exam hall felt less like a school hallway and more like the path to a guillotine. The morning light was harsh, filtering through the high windows in unforgiving beams that illuminated every speck of dust dancing in the air. The castle was strangely quiet, the usual hum of student life dampened by the heavy, suffocating blanket of NEWT anxiety that seemed to physically press against the stone walls. Draco stood by the heavy oak doors, his back rigid against the cold wall. He was immaculately dressed, black robes pressed to razor sharpness, tie knotted with surgical precision, hair gleaming pale gold. To a casual observer, he was the picture of Malfoy arrogance. But Hermione Granger was not a casual observer. She stood 3 feet away, clutching a stack of books she didn't need, her knuckles white. She could see the faint tremor in his hands, which he had tried to hide by clasping them behind his back. She could see the tightness around his eyes, the shallow rhythm of his breathing. "Stop thinking," she whispered. Her voice was low, meant only for him, slipping under the radar of the few other students waiting further down the hall. Draco's grey eyes snapped to hers. They looked haunted. "I'm not thinking. I'm calculating the probability of my wand exploding in Marchbank's face." "It won't explode," Hermione said firmly. She took a half-step closer, invading the bubble of isolation he had built around himself. "You know the theory. You know the motion. You've done it a dozen times." "In a dark tower," Draco muttered, looking at the closed doors. "With you. Not in front of the Wizengamot's oldest relic and McGonagall." "The magic doesn't care who is watching, Draco," she said. "Magic only cares about intent." He looked at her then, really looked at her. For a moment the mask slipped, and she saw the terrified boy who had stood on the astronomy tower years ago, tasked with the impossible. But this time he wasn't alone. "Intent," he repeated, the words sounding like a prayer. "Mr. Malfoy." The door creaked open. Professor McGonagall stood there. She wore her formal emerald robes, her expression severe, though her eyes held a flicker of something that might have been encouragement. Or perhaps just a warning. Draco pushed himself off the wall. He straightened his cuffs. He took a breath that didn't quite fill his lungs. He looked at Hermione one last time. She didn't say, "Good luck." She simply nodded, a sharp, decisive gesture that said, "I am right here. Go." Draco turned and walked into the room. The doors boomed shut behind him, sealing him in. The exam room was vast, stripped of all desks save for a single, lonely table in the center. The air was cold and smelled of ozone and beeswax. At the far end of the room sat the panel. Griselda Marchbanks, ancient and wrinkled like a dried apple, sat in the center. To her left was Professor Tofty. To her right, taking her seat, was McGonagall. They looked like judges at a trial. Draco Lucius Malfoy. Marchbank's voice was surprisingly loud for someone so frail. It scratched against the silence. "Candidate for NEWT Transfiguration. You are here on probationary terms." "I am," Draco said. His voice was steady, trained by years of social etiquette to hide fear. "Proceed to the center," she commanded. "Let us see if the heir of Malfoy can create something other than chaos." The jab was unnecessary, but expected. Draco swallowed the retort that rose to his tongue. He walked to the table. On it lay 3 objects: a rusted iron gauntlet, a cage containing a frantic white rabbit, and a block of rough grey granite. "Task 1, Tofty squeaked, consulting a scroll. "Inanimate to animate. The gauntlet." Draco drew his wand. The hawthorn wood felt slippery in his sweating palm. He focused on the gauntlet. He needed to turn it into a badger. Don't think about the audience. Think about the tower. Think about the rain. "Mutatio melis," he cast. The spell hit the iron. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then the metal groaned. It twisted, reshaping itself with a grinding sound. Fur sprouted from the steel fingers. Claws emerged. In 10 seconds, a badger stood on the table. It was slightly metallic. Its fur had a silver sheen, but it was alive. It sniffed the air and scratched at the wood. "Adequate," Marchbanks sniffed, though the transmutation retains metallurgical properties, a bit stiff in the joints. Draco let out a breath. He hadn't failed yet. Task 2, McGonagall said, her voice crisp. Vanishment. The rabbit. This was the trap. Vanishing a living creature required zero hesitation. If you doubted, you splinched the animal. Half would go to non-being, half would stay. It was messy. It was cruel. Draco looked at the rabbit. Its nose twitched. It was terrified. He remembered the chickens. He remembered Hermione's hand on his wrist, guiding him. Scoop it out of reality. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He visualized the empty cage. He visualized the silence. Evanesco. A clean pop. The cage was empty. No blood, no fur, just empty wire. Clean, McGonagall noted, making a mark on her parchment. Very clean. Task 3. Marchbanks leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. The final hurdle. The animus nobilis. You must transfigure that block of granite into a guardian, a protector. It must display loyalty and sentience. She paused, a cruel smile touching her lips. However, Mr. Malfoy, given your proclivities, we will be watching closely for any dark artifacts. If that stone turns into a serpent or a basilisk, you will be escorted from the grounds immediately. The threat hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Draco stared at the granite block. It was ugly. It was hard. It was just like him. He felt the old panic rising, the darkness. They expect a monster, the voice in his head whispered. Give them a monster. It's what you are. It's what you know. His hand trembled. He could feel the eyes of the judges boring into him. He felt the weight of his father's legacy, the weight of the mark on his arm, burning under his sleeve. He couldn't do it. He didn't know how to be noble. He didn't know how to protect. He only knew how to survive. The silence stretched. Marchbanks tapped her quill impatiently. Mr. Malfoy, today, if you please. Draco closed his eyes. The room began to spin. He was going to fail. He was going to be expelled. He was going to lose everything. And then, in the darkness of his mind, he saw a light. It wasn't a spell. It was a memory. He saw Hermione in the library, handing him the fixed stone hound. He saw her eyes, tired but fierce. He heard her voice, cutting through the storm. Safety isn't a place. Safety is the now. She hadn't fixed him. She hadn't saved him. She had simply stood beside him and refused to leave. She believed he could be good. And for the first time in his miserable life, Draco realized that her belief was stronger than his fear. He didn't need to be a hero. He just needed to be the man who kept her safe. He opened his eyes. The grey of the room seemed to sharpen. The panic receded, replaced by a cool, crystalline focus. He wasn't doing this for the Ministry. He wasn't doing this for the Malfoy name. He was doing this for her. He raised his wand. He didn't slash it. He moved it in a slow, fluid arc, like a conductor silencing an orchestra. Animus nobilis, he whispered. He poured everything into the stone. Not hate, not fear, but gratitude. The desperate, overwhelming gratitude for the second chance she had given him. The granite didn't explode. It didn't crack. It melted. The rock dissolved into a pool of shimmering white light, flowing upward against gravity. It swirled, coalescing, taking form. It grew taller than the badger, taller than the desk. The light solidified. Standing on the table was not a snake. It was not a dragon. It was an otter. A giant, gleaming stone otter, carved from the granite, but possessing the fluidity of water. It stood on its hind legs, its surface polished to a mirror shine. It looked around the room with intelligent eyes. Then, it turned to the judges. It didn't snarl. It didn't attack. It simply stood between Draco and the panel, puffing out its stone chest, a silent, immovable shield. The silence in the room was absolute. McGonagall gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. She recognized the form. She knew exactly whose Patronus took that shape. Marchbanks blinked, leaning back in her chair, her skepticism momentarily shattered by the sheer purity of the Transfiguration. Remarkable, Tofty breathed. Draco stood behind his creation, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down his temple. He felt drained, as if he had run a marathon, but he also felt light. The stone otter turned its head and looked at Draco. It gave a small, almost playful nod. "Finite," Draco rasped, his voice cracking. The otter dissolved back into a rough block of granite with a heavy, dull thud. Draco lowered his wand. He swayed slightly, gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. "Well," Marchbanks said. Her voice was less scratchy now, thoughtful. She exchanged a look with McGonagall. That was unexpected. The form was unconventional for a guardian, but the intent was undeniable, protective, pure. She scribbled something on her parchment. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. "You may go, Mr. Malfoy," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "We will send the results by owl." Draco nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. He turned and walked toward the doors. His legs felt like jelly. He felt raw, exposed, flayed open. He pushed the heavy doors open and stumbled out into the corridor. The sudden brightness of the hallway blinded him for a second. He leaned back against the closed door, closing his eyes, trying to stop the world from tilting. "Draco?" The voice was tentative, anxious. He opened his eyes. Hermione was standing exactly where he had left her. She had dropped her books. They lay in a chaotic pile at her feet. She was twisting her hands together, her eyes wide, searching his face for disaster. Draco pushed himself off the door. He took a step toward her, then another. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving him with a shaking vulnerability that he couldn't hide. Hermione scanned him, his pale face, his trembling hands, the wild look in his eyes. "Did you?" she started, her voice barely a whisper. Draco stopped in front of her. He looked down at her, the messy hair, the ink smudge on her collar, the worry etched into her features. He nodded, just once, a jerky, sharp motion. "I passed," he choked out. The words hung in the air between them. Hermione let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. The tension that had held her upright seemed to snap. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She launched herself at him. It wasn't a graceful embrace. It was a collision. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in the expensive fabric of his robes. The impact nearly knocked him over, but Draco caught her. Instinct took over. His arms went around her waist, pulling her tight, crushing her against him. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of vanilla and parchment and life. "You did it," she mumbled into his shoulder, her voice thick with tears. "I knew you could. I knew it." "It was an otter," Draco whispered into her hair, the confessions slipping out before he could stop it. "The Guardian. It was an otter." Hermione went still in his arms. She pulled back slightly, just enough to look up at him. Her eyes were wide, luminous with shock and Dawn's realization. She knew what her Patronus was. She knew what it meant. "Draco," she breathed. He looked at her, terrified and exhilarated. He was holding Hermione Granger in the middle of a school corridor. He had just confessed the deepest secret of his heart with a piece of stone. "I couldn't think of anything else," he said, his voice rough. "Only you." Hermione didn't pull away. She didn't run. Her gaze dropped to his lips, then back to his eyes. The air between them sizzled, hotter than any fire, brighter than any spell. "You passed," she repeated softly, but the words meant something entirely different now. Draco lifted one hand, his fingers trembling as he brushed a stray curl away from her cheek. "I think," he whispered, "that I am just getting started." The corridor was empty. The exam was over. The war was over. And for the first time, Draco Malfoy wasn't looking for a way out. He was exactly where he wanted to be. The evening sky had scrubbed itself clean of the grey clouds that had suffocated the castle for weeks. In their place, a vast, velvety darkness stretched over Hogwarts, pinned in place by a scattering of cold, brilliant stars. The notice board in the Slytherin common room was usually a place Draco avoided, a catalogue of rules, restrictions, and shunnings. But tonight, a single piece of parchment was pinned to the center, glowing faintly with official ministry magic. NEWT. Retake results. Transfiguration. Draco stood before it, his hands deep in his pockets to hide the fact that they were still trembling hours after the exam. The common room was loud, filled with the post-dinner chatter of students who had never faced a trial, never seen the inside of a cell, never had to rebuild their entire existence from ash. He focused on the ink. Malfoy, Draco L. Grade: exceeds expectations. He stared at the E. It wasn't the outstanding his father would have demanded. It wasn't the perfect score Hermione Granger undoubtedly achieved in her sleep. But as Draco looked at the letter, he didn't feel shame. He felt a strange, buoyant lightness in his chest, as if a lead weight had been unchained from his ankles. He hadn't just passed. He had survived. And more importantly, he had done it honestly. There was no bribery, no intimidation, no dark magic fueled by hatred. Just him, a piece of granite, and a thought of an otter. Going to stare at it all night, Malfoy. Blaise Zabini was lounging on a leather sofa nearby, swirling a glass of fire whiskey. His expression was bored, but his eyes were sharp. "Just checking for errors," Draco murmured, turning away. "The Ministry is known for its incompetence." "You passed," Blaise stated, raising his glass in a mock salute. "Does this mean you'll stop prowling the castle at ungodly hours like a heartbroken vampire?" Draco paused. He looked at the door leading out to the dungeons. "One last prowl," he said softly. "I have to return a book." He didn't have a book. The North Tower was silent. The door was unlocked, as it always was. Draco stepped inside, half expecting the room to be cold and empty, returned to its state of abandonment. It wasn't empty. The candles were lit, not the erratic, floating chaos of their first lessons, but a steady, warm ring of light hovering near the ceiling. The desk had been cleared of the debris of their struggles. No rubber chickens, no shattered stone, no teacups with fur. Just the smooth, worn wood where they had sat opposite each other for 2 months. Hermione was standing by the tall arched window, looking out at the forbidden forest. She wore her casual robes, a thick wool scarf wrapped around her neck against the draft. She turned when she heard the door click shut. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't heavy. It was filled with the echoing resonance of the afternoon's embrace in the corridor, a memory that had been replaying in Draco's mind on an endless, feverish loop. "I saw the notice," she said softly. Her voice was the only sound in the world. "Exceeds expectations," Draco said, walking slowly toward the desk. "Fitting, I suppose. I certainly didn't expect to be standing here." "I did," she countered. She moved away from the window, coming to stand on the opposite side of the desk. The barrier was there, but it felt flimsy now. "I told you, Draco. You just had to get out of your own way." "You did more than tell me," he said. He rested his hands on the back of his chair, gripping the wood. "You dragged me. You pushed me. You stayed." Hermione looked down at her hands. "It was part of the job description." "Don't," Draco said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "Don't do that. Don't pretend this was just a head girl duty. Not after today." He watched her breath hitch. She looked up, and the raw vulnerability in her eyes mirrored his own. "It wasn't duty," she admitted, the words barely audible. "It stopped being duty the night you turned into a toad." A ghost of a smile touched Draco's lips. "A highlight of my academic career, surely." "It was the first time I saw you let go," she said, stepping closer to the desk. "You were so terrified of losing control, Draco. But when you finally did, you weren't a monster. You were just human. And you let me help you." "I didn't have a choice. I was slimy and 3 inches tall." "You had a choice today," she said fiercely. The playful tone vanished. "In the exam room, you chose the form, Draco. You chose the memory." Draco went still. This was it. The precipice. He could step back, make a joke, keep the walls up, and leave this room as Draco Malfoy, the aloof survivor. Or he could jump. He walked around the desk. He stopped inches from her. He could smell the vanilla scent of her shampoo, the faint metallic tang of the ink on her fingers. He felt the heat radiating from her body, a stark contrast to the chill of the stone tower. "I didn't choose a memory," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "I told you before. I couldn't find a memory that wasn't stained. Everything I touched in the past is broken." Hermione looked up at him, her eyes wide, searching his face. "Then how?" "I didn't look back," Draco whispered. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, his were warm. He interlaced them, watching the way his pale skin contrasted with hers. "I looked at you." Hermione let out a soft gasp. She didn't pull away. Her grip tightened on his hand. "The otter," she breathed. "It wasn't a coincidence." "It was a reflection," Draco corrected. He raised his eyes to hers, letting her see everything. The guilt, the hope, the terrifying depth of his affection. "I needed to visualize safety. I needed to visualize something worth protecting, something that makes me want to be better." He raised his free hand and cupped her cheek. Her skin was soft, and she leaned into his touch instinctively, her eyes fluttering shut for a heartbeat before opening again, bright with unshed tears. "You are the only thing that makes sense in this castle, Hermione," he said, using her name like a benediction. "You are the only silence in the noise." "Draco," she whispered. Her voice broke. "Do you have any idea how dangerous this is? Us?" "I don't care," he said, fierce and low. "I spent my whole life worrying about blood status and pedigree and what my father would say. Look where it got me. a mark on my arm and a soul full of ghosts. He stepped closer, eliminating the last fraction of space between them. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. I'm done being safe, Granger. I want to be happy, or at least, I want to be near you. Hermione stared at him, and he saw the moment the last of her resistance crumbled. The brilliant, logical, stubborn witch who had fought a war and won finally surrendered. I don't want you to be safe, she whispered, a tremulous smile breaking through her seriousness. I want you to be brave. I'm trying, he murmured. Then he lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't like the spells they had practiced, calculated, precise, theoretical. It was messy and desperate and overwhelmingly real. Hermione's hands flew up to tangle in his hair, pulling him down to her. Draco's arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her slightly, pressing her against the edge of the desk. The kiss tasted of coffee and relief. It tasted like the end of a long, dark winter. It was a collision of two worlds that should never have touched, sparking a fire that burned away the prejudices and the pain of the last 7 years. Draco poured everything into it, every silent apology, every secret admiration, every moment he had watched her from across the great hall and wished he was someone else. He kissed her until the room spun, until he forgot about the NEWTs, until the only reality was the softness of her lips and the fierce grip of her hands on his shoulders. When they finally broke apart, breathless and flushed, the silence in the tower was no longer empty. It was full. It hummed with possibility. Draco rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, breathing in her scent. He felt anchored. For the first time in his life, he wasn't drifting. So, Hermione whispered, her voice husky. She ran her thumb over the lapel of his robe. Does this mean the tutoring is over? Draco opened his eyes. He pulled back slightly to look at her. Her lips were swollen, her cheeks pink, her hair a glorious, chaotic halo. She looked beautiful. The Transfiguration lessons are concluded, he said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Not a sneer, but a genuine expression of amusement. However, I find my charms work is woefully inadequate. I might need extensive private instruction. Hermione laughed. It was the same bright, bubbling sound that had started this whole mess when the rubber chickens had exploded. I think you'll find, she said, smoothing the collar of his shirt with proprietary gentleness, that I am a very strict teacher, Mr. Malfoy. I'm counting on it, he replied. He took her hand again, bringing it to his lips to kiss the knuckles, right over the ink stain on her middle finger. Come on, he said softly. Let's get out of here. Where are we going? Draco looked toward the door, then back at the window where the moonlight was spilling in, bathing the room in silver. The storm was gone. The path ahead was unclear, fraught with difficulties. The press, his parents, her friends. It wouldn't be easy. But as he looked at Hermione Granger, holding his hand in the center of the tower where they had fallen in love amidst failures and feathers, Draco knew one thing for certain. Forward, he said. He led her out of the North Tower, leaving the door ajar behind them. They walked down the spiral staircase, their footsteps echoing in rhythm, two shadows merging into one, walking out of the darkness and into the light of a new, unwritten beginning.
Writing this story felt like painting with light and shadow. I loved exploring the idea that magic is inextricably linked to emotion, using Draco's failed spells, from the chaotic rubber chickens to the exploded statue, as a mirror for his eternal turmoil. The transition from the cold drafty tower to a warm sanctuary of candlelight perfectly paced their savings relationship. My favorite element was the show don't tell aspect of their intimacy. The third scene was crucial. It stripped away Draco's pride and forced a physical vulnerability that broke the deadlock between them. The choice of the author for his final exam wasn't just a plot point, it was the ultimate surrender of his ego. It turned out to be a story less about passing an exam and more about Draco learning that he is allowed to be safe, rather than just surviving. It feels like a very honest, earned, happy ending.